What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are picking up with Christopher Priest's inaugural run of the Justice League with the People versus the Justice League. And you guys are going to have to bear with me in this video because I have food poisoning. So I am, against my better judgment, I am recording this while I am in no position to record anything. But the funny thing about Christopher Priest's writing is it can be difficult to follow. People who are reading Deathstroke Rebirth, you guys know what I'm talking about. Like Christopher Priest will jump from the past to the present. Now the good thing is that in this story, he doesn't do that. It's a pretty linear chronology. And in truth, this actually is really more of a 1998 feel for Black Panther than it is for the Justice League, just because of the fact that during that run, each comic was really more of like a standalone story, but it fed into the greater whole of like the full story arc. So in truth, you could read each one of these comic books individually because each one doesn't really build on the last. It does to a degree, but not in the extreme. It's just like one or two plot points that kind of continue on to the next thing. So it's pretty easy to follow and pretty straightforward. But this story is basically designed to answer the question, in DC Rebirth, Batman has a team in Detective Comics, and Batman has his own events in his own solo series, and Batman's leading his own Justice League of America team, and Batman is part of Trinity with Superman and Wonder Woman. With all these things that Batman has going on, what happens when it all catches up to him? And what happens when Batman fails? And that's what's so cool about this, because remember, while Superman is probably the most powerful member of the Justice League, going back and forth a bit between like Green Lantern and Wonder Woman, depending on who's writing the story, by and large, Batman's basically considered to be the leader of the team, just because of the fact that he's like the brains behind the operation. And so the funny thing is that within, in this particular segment, over the course of 4 days, Batman's had about 3 hours of sleep, over about 3 days, Batman's had about 4 hours of sleep. So at this point, like he's literally running on fumes. And the issue is that once he gets to the Justice League Watchtower, it's not some massive event that's taking place here. And that's the cool thing about Christopher Priest writing in the story. It's not like a planet-threatening event. I mean, on the whole with the Justice League, we usually expect it to be just because of the fact that it's the Justice League. But the cool thing is that it kind of grounds the team a bit. Instead, they're dealing with more small-time threats, things like construction accidents and earthquakes and different things along those lines, because it's one of the things that tends to sort of get lost in the Justice League storytelling from various writers is people tend to lose perspective that like the Justice League team is basically a humanitarian team. Now, of course, the funny thing about this is that this takes place, really has like 3 events going on at the same time. The first is that there's essentially like a massive earthquake or something like that set off this tsunami, more or less. The other thing is that there's a whole bunch of ships that are traveling towards Earth. And the third thing is that there is a hostage situation with regards to like a handful of nuns in a religious fundamentalist group. Now, the cool thing about this is that the characters are basically playing roles that we wouldn't normally see them play. For example, Aquaman is like a bus driver. Wonder Woman is just kind of like a person who's operating as like a mail delivery individual. And then of course, Batman's kind of, watching everything unfold, pretending to be a bus passenger. But the reason why they're in this position is because they're reconning, more or less. They're going through and they're looking around and, trying to figure out what's going on here. Now, again, this is not normal. This is not something we usually see. And that's why you kind of have to take the Christopher Priest Justice League run with like, okay, this is sort of a new direction for the team, because normally they would just bust in, right? They would just come flying in and they would just be like, all right, this whole thing's done, and defeat the criminals and the day would be saved and that would be about it. But that's why I like this, is because it's so much more grounded. Once they get in there to the whole facility, in truth, Aquaman shouldn't be here. Aquaman should be at the coastal city that's being threatened by a massive amount of water. But Batman, in his error and his exhaustion, has basically made the wrong call here. And so the whole idea behind this is that Batman makes the call to send Aquaman back over to the coast, or send him to the coastal city to deal with that whole scenario. And in turn, they basically bust in and start dealing with the whole hostage situation. Now, the problem with this is that the police are responding at the same time. And so what the Justice League did for the most part have it under control, the cops showing up out of nowhere and basically raiding the whole place meant that one of the guys freaked out. They grabbed the sword of Wonder Woman and they stabbed the nun through the chest. And so one of the people here is basically killed. Now, at this point, we end up finding out that what was going on with all those ships basically going through and looking around, it wasn't really an alien invasion so much as it was like a tourist attraction. Basically, it was people who were going on this big tour of the galaxy and they just flew by Earth. That's all it is. The issue here is that in truth, had Cyborg been here like he was supposed to, had Batman taken the scenario as he should have, which is to say, basically contacting the police, saying, everybody stand down, we've got this, or letting the police, go in and do their own thing, then this nun wouldn't have died. And so people are starting to look at Batman with a slanted eye, essentially saying, hey, look, this guy's not necessarily making the right kind of judgment calls. We should really question whether or not this guy is legit. Now, at this point, we switch back over to the Watchtower, a little bit after this whole event's taken place. And of course, you end up having like Jessica Cruz who's walked in on in the John by just some guy named Glenn Gamoran. Now, Glenn Gamoran is an old school DC character. This guy made his appearance back in 1995 with Justice League Task Force, and in truth, that's one of the reasons why I kind of held off on this. This is not Christopher Priest's first time writing a Justice League title. One of the things that we've talked about in previous videos was that the Justice League of America originally appeared back in like 1960. Running for about 25 years or so, the Justice League was like DC's, well, at least, they were for a time their premier team. Eventually, the Teen Titans took over that popularity just because teenagers loved the idea of the Teen Titans. But the fact remains here that in the post-crisis landscape, meaning going after 1985, running up until 1998, DC had a whole bunch of Justice League titles. You had Justice League International, which became Justice League Europe. You had Justice League Task Force. You had Extreme Justice. You had a lot of these different spin-off titles from the main Justice League team. And the whole idea was to try to see if there was a way to basically revamp the Justice League team so that it could in turn become a title that would promote characters who really just couldn't hold their own books, kind of become a revolving door for fans to be introduced to heroes and different things like that they wouldn't normally read. Now, eventually, it kind of became, it was really successful at first, but once like Keith Giffen basically walked away, once they moved away from the whole thing, what ended up happening is in 1998, DC brought Justice League back with JLA under Grant Morrison. But Christopher Priest was one of the writers who was contributing to Justice League Task Force back during that time. Now, Glenn Gamoran's only appeared in like 14 comics. So again, he's not like a huge character in the realm of DC. He's just a guy who's there. But most of his escapades out of Bounty Hunter dealt with Martian Manhunter. And that's the reason why when he shows up here, he asks where Martian Manhunter is. Now, this is where things get a little hairy here. We know Martian Manhunter is back in like Dark Knight's Metal. We covered that, several weeks ago. So we know Martian Manhunter has returned. But Martian Manhunter being there was part and parcel to what was going on with like the Green Lantern Hal Jordan. And so the issue is that when Batman steps up and says, we haven't seen or heard from Martian Manhunter in quite some time, then it can only mean a couple of things. Either it means that like Batman knows about Martian Manhunter being back. Maybe they had a run-in of sorts at the end of Dark Knight's Metal. We won't know until that story comes out. Or Martian Manhunter's involvement was isolated to like Mr. Terrific and Hal Jordan and like Plastic Man, and that's it. Like he never returned to Earth. He never came back to see any of the other members of the Justice League. They don't know he's alive, and for whatever reason, Hal Jordan hasn't told them yet. Mr. Terrific hasn't told them yet. We don't really know. We kind of have to just take this with a grain of salt. But what we end up finding out here, and again, this is how each of these stories is kind of isolated and sort of, self-contained. What we end up finding out here is there's basically like this intergalactic cockroach, more or less. It's like a sentient cockroach, and it showed up on Earth somewhere along the line, and Glenn Gamoran's been sent as a bounty hunter to grab this cockroach. The issue with this is that it can procreate with other cockroaches and in turn create a kind of hive mind. Now, again, this is a little off the beaten path. It is a little strange, but remember, with Christopher Priest's inaugural run here, it's kind of like hitting all the different facets, hitting all the different aspects of the Justice League. This is really more of a throwback to like 1960s Justice League. This is the kind of story you would read back in the 1960s, some intergalactic cockroach with the ability to like procreate with regular cockroaches, spawns a hive mind and a giant cockroach thing, and of course it really just kind of leads into the team using a combination of like, electromagnetism and a handful of sound waves and so on to basically isolate this roach, and then of course this capture by Glenn Gamoran. There's not a whole lot to draw from here. It's just kind of a fill-in, few set of events. What the big takeaway is from this story is that breaking news, found footage more or less has basically reached the press. And what this does is it shows the idea that the nun was killed because of the intervention of the Justice League, that they jumped in, they basically overruled the cops, and in turn it got this woman killed. And so the picture that's being painted in the eyes of the general public is that the Justice League is overstepping its bounds. And so when you have something like the Justice League, which has jumped into, some pretty questionable actions in the past, and if you take this as something that exists as like the aftermath of Dark Knight's Metal, meaning we've had all of Metropolis turned into Doomsdays, we've had these evil versions of Batman from the Dark Multiverse invading Earth and attacking all these cities and killing all these people, then suddenly people's trust in the Justice League begins to erode. Now, all of this is compounded by the fact that there's a woman named Mrs. Hosgrove, who's basically the head of a commission in Congress that's designed to basically question the Justice League and see whether or not they are acting as they're supposed to. Now, of course, Superman shows up and says, hey, look, this is everything that's going on, and we're by no means trying to be violent people, so on and so forth. This is compounded by the fact that while she's driving, she's suddenly met by the arrival of Batman, who throws a batarang through her head and kills her. And so again, this is crazy because it starts to go into this idea that like things are spinning out of control, that like the Justice League has taken this sort of dark and evil perspective. Now, this all stems with the idea that the person, the individual who's Batman is not actually Bruce Wayne. Instead, it's basically just a person they call the Fan. Now, this guy's name is actually Joshua Christian. We'll talk about him here in a second, but it's essentially someone who's obsessed with the Justice League. Like he's considered to be a fan, he's an extremist, and taking out, Miss Hosgrove basically eliminates this oversight committee that's designed to monitor lecture the Justice League and even ask the question, should they be brought in under a special charter and controlled by the federal government? So the whole idea is that Batman basically grabs Simon Baz and sends him in to where this fan is supposed to be located at, under the auspices that Simon Baz can basically, neutralize him using his ring and so on and so forth, only to be met by the power of the Black Canary. And so this is where we end up finding out that this fan knows a lot about the Justice League, knows quite a bit. And this all stems back to his early days. What we end up finding out here is that there was a point in time when the fan was basically a younger kid, and the Justice League was facing off against Shaggy Man, a character like Doomsday that has the ability to heal and adapt to attacks and different things like that. But the fan was watching this whole event unfold, and the fan was basically a huge fan of the Justice League. Joshua idolized them in the extreme. He had a toy Green Lantern ring, different things like that. He stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. That was the whole basis behind it. His life led him into the military. He was a person that was always trying to be one of these individuals who could basically go on to become what he believed the Justice League was, which is to say, making the world a better place. The problem with this is that in his mind, he has kind of a psychological break. He genuinely believes he's doing the right thing. Now, the other half of this is that with Simon Baz being off the radar, there's two things that are basically going on. The first is that you have the public action of the Justice League, which is to say, going on the news and basically saying, hey, look, here's where we stand in relation to things. One, we don't really have a problem with individuals who want to help the Justice League. Just understand, you can't take the law into your own hands like that. The backside of the Justice League, kind of the hidden hand of the Justice League here, is Jessica Cruz going in at the direction of Batman and trying to locate Simon Baz, only to find out the building's basically been booby-trapped. And so again, that's when we end up learning this guy knows a lot about the Justice League. I mean, grabbing the whole idea of Simon Baz, effectively this guy takes the ring of Simon, puts it in a container and says, this thing's designed to keep your ring in like suspended animation more or less, so that your ring will always try to escape. It won't be able to, but it'll basically drain its power, which is kind of interesting. We'll actually find out more about that here in a second. But the issue with this is that for Simon, that doesn't make any sense. The Green Lantern ring is a product of willpower, meaning that under normal circumstances, no one should be able to take the ring and basically remove it from a lantern and then put it in some form of stasis the lantern can't get to. The ring will break out because it's one of the most powerful objects in the universe. And so Simon Baz realizes two things. One, the ring in this container is not this ring. And two, the basically sound vibrations of Black Canary had scrambled his mind to a degree that he never even realized his ring was gone, or his ring was on his hand in the first place. It's been there the entire time. He just didn't realize it. Now again, this goes to the extent of how well this fan knows the various members of the Justice League. Jumping in and then basically neutralizing a Green Lantern, which is no easy feat, impersonating Batman, having the physical prowess to trick people into believing that he is legitimately Batman, that's a pretty big moment, and that's a pretty big thing. But this was designed to basically lure him out. The whole circumstance of Diana Prince, of Wonder Woman, sitting on national TV and saying, look, we cannot condone the actions of a vigilante who would kill people he doesn't like just because of the fact that their views are different from his. It was designed to lure out Joshua. It was designed to bring him into the open, and that's exactly what happens. But where the Justice League believes that on the surface they have him contained, this is where we find out his knowledge of the Justice League extends exceedingly far when we learn that he has access to the Watchtower and teleports all the members of the Justice League across the globe. Just teleports them to all these random locations. Now again, with the fan seemingly making his escape, this really just kind of turns into like a rounding up trip. You have these different things going on, rounding up various people, so on and so forth, grabbing members of the Justice League, bringing them all together. But again, the whole idea of this fan is daunting to Batman. He finds it hard to believe that a member of the, really just like a normal human out there, could basically become so obsessed with the Justice League, he could in turn become one of the many individuals who helped to construct the Watchtower, thereby learning about all its security systems. He could also basically impersonate Batman with nobody really knowing what's going on. He could neutralize all the members of the Justice League. That's hard pressed for Batman to believe. Now again, this is not the first time something like this has happened, and that's why it's kind of interesting when it comes to how Batman's written in this situation. This is one of those things where Batman kind of looks around and says, maybe this is my fault. Like maybe I am the reason why this is all screwed up. And that's why he starts to rethink his position in the Justice League. And so while all this is going on, because of the fact that the Watchtower has basically been shut down, all of its systems have been deactivated by Joshua, you have the Flash there trying to get everything back online. But then suddenly the Watchtower is met with a crash, which is the result of a maintenance crew from LexCorp. And so basically almost everyone on this maintenance crew seems to have been dead. It seems to have been killed in the crash, except for one guy. And of course, when the Justice League shows back up at the same time, they don't realize that like the Flash, Barry Allen, is out there in space trying to grab this guy before he floats off into oblivion. And so in their minds, when they show up here, it seems more of like an unmanned ship that tried to dock itself with the Watchtower, and they'll tend to it here in a minute, all the while not realizing that Barry Allen's floating out there in space. Now, the other half of this is that Barry Allen's written a little strange here. The way he's written here is that he basically treated space like it was just kind of a getaway, like it didn't really matter that much. And the reason why this happens is because he basically uses his, kind of uses a Speed Force burst to run up on this guy and inadvertently kind of sparks an electric static feedback more or less and like kills this guy in the process. But the whole idea is that Barry kind of looks around around and says, well, it's my recklessness that caused this. I should have been a lot more careful. But when you're Barry Allen and you've done things like travel to other dimensions, different things like that, I kind of find it hard to believe that he wouldn't take space seriously. It's just kind of a matter of perspective. It really just kind of depends on how you look at it. Now, this is where things get kind of crazy. And so in the sense of the Flash's powers, I kind of like this because again, it's kind of like a throwback to the old school comics. But what ends up happening is Christopher Priest basically creates this scenario where Barry Allen sits down and says, okay, whenever I run as the Flash, I kind of have this Speed Force aura that protects me. Now, the Speed Force aura protecting me is contingent on, like, you know, having an atmosphere, oxygen to breathe, and different things like that. And so I'm willing to bet that I can basically catapult myself out of here. I can take off back to the Watchtower, and my Speed Force aura will protect me for as long as it can, but I should be able to make it. Basically, Barry Allen runs in space by running on the little pieces of debris of the ship and, you know, the Watchtower that have just kind of spread all over the place. It's a little questionable at best, but this is kind of like classic 1990s storytelling. This is kind of like classic, you know, Flash storytelling. But the whole aftermath of this, of course, Barry Allen's healing factor will bring him back pretty quickly. I mean, it's not a huge deal. It goes on to, you know, basically have the repairs that are being made to the Justice League Watchtower and so on. But in the aftermath of the whole idea of the fan, in the aftermath of the Nun being killed by the fact that Batman made the wrong choices, what he does is basically step down from the Justice League. It's also kind of weird that Jessica Cruz kisses him. It's kind of weird considering that, like, he's engaged to Selina Kyle. But I always had a feeling that Bruce Wayne was never really like a one-woman bat. You know what I mean? Like, you know, he's like, hey, look, you know, I mean, Selina Kyle, I love you to death. Like, you know, we'll be together forever. But like, until that ring goes on your finger, woman, like, I'm out there. I mean, I'd like to think Batman would be more honorable than to, like, you know, step out on Selina Kyle, which I don't know why you would, man. Like, she's super hot. But the fact remains here that Batman, as he's leaving, basically chooses a successor. He simply sits down and says, someone has to be the leader of the Justice League. And according to our charter, I have the right to select who the new chairman's going to be. And under normal circumstances, we would expect Superman. The last person I would expect is Cyborg. And that's what's so interesting about this is, you know, Batman chooses Cyborg to be the new leader of the Justice League. Now, what this means is actually covered in Justice Lost, you know, when the next story arc that follows after this, which is currently ongoing. It's not finished yet. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.